The desert moon of Zor 9 stretched endlessly beneath a pale amber sky, a landscape of cracked basalt, glassy dunes, and shifting heat that seemed to hum with indifference. When the drop pod hatch hissed open, Cadet Laura Kent stepped into the scorching wind and felt the air slice at her throat like dry smoke. The Galactic Academy had chosen this wasteland for a reason. It was the most hostile training ground within 20 parsecs, a planet that devoured the unprepared. Around her, the other cadets stumbled from their pods, shielding their eyes and gasping through their respirators. The assignment was clear. Build a shelter. Survive 72 hours. No external aid. Laura's boots sank half an inch into the coarse red dust as she surveyed the horizon. Her visor displayed temperature and wind velocity, both well beyond the limits of comfort for most of the species assembled. The reptilian cadets from Karna hissed softly, their scales drying out already under the twin suns. The insectoid Drakians beat their wings in distress to vent heat, while the gelatinous Eryxian recruits emitted a low, mournful vibration as parts of their translucent bodies began to desiccate. Above the whine of the wind came the crackle of the instructor's voice through the comlink. You have 72 hours to complete the task. Collaboration is allowed, but not encouraged. Failure means expulsion. Within minutes, chaos took root. Arguments flared about territory, shade, and water. 2 avian cadets accused a scaled one of stealing a ration canister. Drac, the insectoid nearest to Laura, buzzed his wings irritably and gestured toward a shallow depression that might serve as a temporary camp. She glanced at the spot, then shook her head. It was too exposed, and the sand around it was too fine, a sign that flash floods occasionally swept through. That place will drown the moment the wind changes, she said calmly, her voice muffled through the respirator. Drac stared at her with confusion, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the glare. There is no water here, he protested. The readings say none for miles. Laura only smiled behind the mask. Readings aren't everything. Look at the crust. It's brittle and sun-baked on top, but see those cracks? Something once flowed there. It still might. While others kept shouting about command hierarchy, Laura began to walk. She traced her gloved fingers along the fissures in the ground, following the slope of the terrain toward a shallow basin framed by black stone. The place was ugly and barren, but it had shelter from one side and an uneven surface that hinted at underground minerals. To her, it was perfect. She dropped her gear, knelt, and pressed her hand to the ground. The heat radiating from below was immense, but there was a pulse of moisture when she dug 2 inches deeper with her knife. That was all she needed to confirm her instinct. She turned back toward the other cadets and called out through the comlink, "I'm setting camp here. Anyone who wants to live past tomorrow might want to follow." No one moved at first. To the aliens, the idea of trusting a human, a species barely a century old in galactic terms, seemed absurd. Humans were regarded as reckless improvisers, gifted in chaos, but unrefined in science. The Academy instructors often used them as control variables in mixed species experiments. But Laura was not there to prove worth. She had grown up on the Martian frontier, where storms could strip flesh from bone and oxygen generators failed without warning. Survival for her was not a theory. It was muscle memory. She adjusted the straps on her thermal pack and began marking the perimeter of her camp with small metal stakes. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the jagged plain. Laura built a low ridge of stones to break the wind and started to dig a trench using the flat end of her multi-tool. The work was slow and brutal. Sweat soaked her undersuit despite the cooling system. She paused only once, looking up at the horizon where small silhouettes, other cadets, wandered aimlessly, still arguing or collapsing into exhaustion. A faint shimmer of heat rose from their positions, mirage-like. She forced herself to keep going, breaking rocks with rhythmic precision, creating a shallow pit where cooler air could collect. Every action was deliberate. Every movement was quiet, focused, human. Hours passed. By the time darkness began to creep across the desert, she had already constructed a rough shelter by interlocking flat stones and binding them with melted resin from her emergency kit. It wasn't elegant, but it would hold. The twin moons rose, washing the desert in silver-blue light, and with the heat gone, the cold came swiftly. The wind sharpened to a freezing gale. Across the dunes, faint lights flickered, cadets struggling to ignite plasma torches or huddle under thermal sheets. Laura crouched beside her makeshift wall and ignited a small flame inside a hollowed rock basin, feeding it with dried fibrous plants she had gathered earlier. The fire sputtered, coughed, and finally caught. For a moment, she simply watched it. Fire had always mesmerized her, not for its beauty, but for its defiance. Here, on a dead moon, millions of light years from Earth, a human spark still burned. The warmth radiated outward, and soon she wasn't alone. Drac approached hesitantly, his mandibles twitching. Behind him came two small avian cadets, their feathers puffed in distress. "You made light," Drac said softly, almost reverently. "We have failed all attempts." Laura gestured toward the fire. "Sit close, but not too close. You'll feel better in minutes." The avians exchanged wary glances, but the promise of warmth overpowered their pride. They sat, trembling, as she adjusted the flame. Soon, their breathing slowed. Drac tilted his head, watching her work with alien curiosity. "You shape the world," he murmured. "Without plasma tools, without command protocols. You just act." She smiled faintly. "That's how humans survived long before we had starships. We built things by hand, even when we were freezing." As the night deepened, the wind howled like an animal circling its prey. The fire flickered, but Laura shielded it with a makeshift windbreak. She checked her camp perimeter, simple but effective. She had used mineral shards to form a faint reflective ring, a warning line visible in low light. Her water extractor hummed softly beside her. Inside its chamber, condensation began to form, drop by precious drop. Each droplet was a promise of survival. She took a slow sip and handed the rest to Drac. He hesitated before accepting it. "You share resources," he said. "In my culture, that is forbidden until dominance is proven." Laura replied quietly, "Maybe dominance isn't what keeps you alive out here." By midnight, the temperature dropped below freezing. Frost began to form along the stone walls of her shelter. The aliens huddled together for warmth, while she adjusted the airflow through the narrow chimney she had carved in the rock. The flames steadied again, casting shadows that danced across the faces of the exhausted cadets. Some slept sitting upright. Others simply stared into the fire, lost in disbelief that something so primitive could work where technology failed. Laura leaned back against the wall, her muscles aching but her mind sharp. She reviewed the day's work in silence. She had fire, partial shelter, and enough data to locate underground moisture by morning. Tomorrow, she would need to find food sources and begin shaping clay for stronger construction. Her ancestors had built civilizations from nothing but dirt and determination. She could do the same here. When she finally allowed herself to close her eyes, the stars above Zor 9 shimmered like shards of ancient glass. The alien cadets slept soundly for the first time since the drop, wrapped in faint warmth and safety they hadn't believed possible. From orbit, the instructors monitoring the simulation marked her coordinates with curiosity. Out of dozens of cadets, only one had built a functioning base within the first cycle. They logged a note in her file. "Human subject demonstrates non-standard problem-solving behavior. Further observation recommended." Laura didn't know she had already become the focal point of their data reports. She only knew that the wind was shifting again, carrying fine grains of dust into the air. She pulled her blanket tighter and listened to the rhythmic crackle of the fire. Tomorrow would bring harsher trials, but she had no doubt she would adapt. She always did. In the vast silence of the alien desert, surrounded by beings who barely understood her, Laura Kent slept beside the oldest friend of her species, the flame that refused to die. The first light of Zor 9's twin suns crawled slowly over the dunes, staining the landscape in bands of orange and copper. Laura opened her eyes before dawn, already feeling the cold fading into dry heat. Her throat was rough from breathing through the filter all night, and her muscles ached from the hard ground beneath her. But she was alive, and that was enough. Around her, the other cadets still slept, curled into small shapes near the dying fire. The alien air was sharp and sterile, carrying no scent of life, no sign of movement, except the faint whisper of shifting sand. She stood, brushed the dust from her suit, and adjusted the seals on her gloves. The storm from the night before had shifted the topsoil, uncovering pockets of mineral flakes glittering faintly in the morning light. She crouched and touched one. The texture was brittle, almost crystalline, and as she rubbed it between her fingers, it left a metallic sheen. Iron oxide. That was useful. If she could find enough of it, she could begin shaping tools, or at least reinforce her shelter before the next storm. She marked the spot with a shard of stone and began tracing the pattern of the dunes with her eyes. When Drax stirred awake behind her, his antennae quivered. "You work before sustenance," he said, his voice dry and rasping. "You are strange." Laura gave a faint smile. "Where I come from, breakfast waits until the world stops trying to kill you." He tilted his head, still trying to decode her humor. "Then it never waits long," he said softly, almost like an observation rather than a joke. She nodded. Exactly. The fire had died completely, leaving only a black circle of ash and melted sand. Laura crouched beside it, sifting through the remains, pocketing bits of hardened slag. It was crude glass, weak but reflective. She placed it in a small pile with the metal flakes she had gathered. As she worked, the avian cadets awoke, stretching their feathered limbs and murmuring among themselves. Their bright plumage looked dull in the harsh light, but their eyes followed her movements with open curiosity. One of them, a young male named Cairo, asked cautiously, "Why do you collect trash?" "Because survival is architecture," she answered without looking up. "You build from what you have, not what you wish for." She picked up a flat piece of basalt and tested its weight. It was heavy enough to use as a hammerstone. The avian blinked, clearly not understanding, but Drax seemed to. He walked closer, his mandibles clicking softly as he studied her improvised toolkit. "You mean to build again?" he said, his tone almost admiring. "Even when no one commands you?" Laura nodded and began working. She arranged her materials in neat rows, carving small grooves in the sand for sorting: stones, metals, glass. It was a ritual born of experience, a way to bring order to chaos. She had learned that organization was not luxury. It was survival condensed into form. Each object represented a future solution she might need before the day ended. The heat began to rise, pressing against her suit like a physical weight, but she continued. By midday, the other cadets started wandering off to search for shade or argue about water distribution. Only Drax stayed close, driven more by curiosity than loyalty. He helped carry larger stones back to camp, fascinated by the human's precision. When she struck one stone against another to create sparks, his wings flared in alarm. "You conjure energy," he exclaimed. She laughed softly. "No, I just make it visible." It took hours of grinding, striking, and patient adjustment before the first ember appeared, but when it did, it was alive, tiny, golden, fragile. She leaned over it, feeding it with shavings of dried plant fiber until a thin wisp of smoke rose. The aliens gathered again, drawn by the sight of the fire returning. Laura noticed their hesitation, the same instinctive fear many species had of uncontrolled flame. To them, it symbolized destruction. To her, it was life. "Come closer," she said quietly. "The fire won't hurt you if you respect it." She used a stick to push the coals into a small pit she had lined with glass shards, creating a crude but stable hearth. The heat intensified, and the cold tension that had clung to the group since the drop began to fade. She took one of her metal fragments and placed it carefully on a flat rock near the fire. Within minutes, it began to glow faintly. The avians gasped, feathers puffing up in alarm. Drac leaned forward, transfixed. "You melt the land," he whispered. Laura nodded. "I need to see what this planet can give me. Every world hides something useful." She tested the metal's pliability and realized it could be reshaped into fastenings or hooks. Primitive, yes, but efficient. By late afternoon, the temperature was punishing. The dunes rippled with heat mirages, and the air vibrated like the inside of a furnace. Most cadets retreated beneath scraps of shadecloth, but Laura refused to stop. She built small windbreaks from flat rocks, arranged at precise angles to deflect the gusts that swept across the camp. Her movements were mechanical but thoughtful, each task built upon the last. Drac eventually joined her again, panting slightly. "You ignore the exhaustion," he said. "It will claim you." "It might," she replied, "but only if I give it permission." The wind carried her words across the camp, where others listened silently. For the first time since arrival, there was no bickering, no shouting, only the rhythmic sound of her hammerstone striking rock. When the wind shifted again, she paused, eyes narrowing. Fine dust particles began to swirl in unnatural patterns. She felt the pressure drop slightly, an instinct honed from years of frontier storms. A minor squall was coming. It would be short, but fierce. "Get inside your shelters," she warned. "Seal what you can. Stay low." The cadets scattered, some following her advice, others panicking. She reinforced her stone wall, using melted resin as adhesive, then dragged a sheet of scorched metal to act as a roof panel. When the wind hit, it came with the force of an ocean wave, slicing, roaring, alive. Her shelter groaned under the impact, but held. She pressed her back against the wall, shielding the fire as sand lashed through cracks. Minutes later, the world fell silent again. The storm had passed, leaving the camp half buried. She emerged slowly, her suit coated in fine dust. The fire still glowed faintly, a small miracle. The others crawled out of their damaged shelters, coughing and shaken. One of the avians had lost part of his nest-like structure and stared in despair at the wreckage. Laura approached him, kneeling beside the ruin. Without a word, she began to rebuild it. Simpler, sturdier, using interlocked stones and clay paste. The avian watched, speechless, until he realized she expected him to help. Together, they finished it before sunset. When night fell, the camp looked different. It was still primitive, still temporary, but there was order now. Fires flickered where there had been none. The cadets who had laughed at her primitive methods earlier now clustered around her hearth, trading small pieces of food and sharing stories in halting translation. Laura listened quietly, her eyes reflecting the orange glow. She didn't need to speak to earn their trust anymore. She had proven something far more powerful, that survival was a language older than pride. As the stars returned overhead, Drac approached her again. He studied the glowing coals and asked, "Do you build because you must, or because you can't stop?" Laura considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Both. Building keeps me alive, but it also reminds me why staying alive matters." The insectoid tilted his head. "Your kind is strange," he said. "You find meaning where others find only endurance." She smirked faintly. "Maybe that's what makes us dangerous." The wind softened into a low hum, carrying traces of warmth from the fires. The cadets settled for the night, their shelters stronger, their spirits steadier. Laura sat awake long after the others had fallen silent, feeding the embers one by one. Each spark that drifted upward disappeared into the night, swallowed by the infinite desert sky. But in her mind, it marked progress, a tiny victory against the void. She didn't know it yet, but orbiting above, the instructors watched with growing unease. The human was not merely surviving, she was altering the experiment. The training site, designed to test individual endurance, had become a functioning camp. Leadership had emerged where there was meant to be isolation. Cooperation had replaced competition, and at the center of it all sat a human girl, her face lit by firelight, her hands streaked with ash, staring at the flames as if speaking to them in an ancient, secret language. The second morning on Zor 9 began without warning. The first rays of sunlight hit the desert floor like blades, burning away the calm of the night and replacing it with shimmering heat that bent the horizon into liquid waves. Laura awoke before the others again, the habit of vigilance so deeply carved into her bones that rest felt unnatural. She pushed herself upright, blinking the grit from her eyes, and took in the silence that had settled over the camp. It was no longer chaos. The alien cadets who had once argued now moved with quiet purpose, following small routines she had taught them, checking water collectors, reinforcing walls, tending the scattered fires. None of this had been planned. It had simply happened around her, as if survival itself had chosen her as its architect. She walked a slow circle around the camp, examining every structure. The shelters were still crude but stable, and the air smelled faintly of ash and damp stone. That last scent intrigued her. Somewhere beneath the surface, there was more moisture than she'd thought, trapped under hardened crust. If she could expose it, even a small amount, she could mix proper clay and start building something stronger. Not just a shelter, but infrastructure. Civilization always began with two things: fire and clay. Laura stopped at the edge of her hearth, crouched, and ran her fingers along the glass-like surface formed by yesterday's heat. It was fused sand, primitive glass. Beneath it, the fire pit still pulsed with low embers. She stirred them carefully and fed a few dry fibers until the orange glow returned. The flame responded like an old friend. She sat back, watching the light play across her dusty gloves, and whispered under her breath, "Let's build something that lasts." Her first task was finding the right material. She took her toolkit, a compact set of chisels, wire loops, and a small scanner, and began exploring the rocky basin beyond camp. The landscape was harsh and beautiful in equal measure, layered with jagged basalt ridges and streaks of red ore that gleamed when the sun struck them. She followed a fault line for nearly an hour before she found what she wanted, a pocket of softer earth near the shadow of a collapsed ridge. She knelt, pressed her palm into it, and smiled. The soil was heavier, denser, true clay. She filled her satchel, testing its weight as she climbed back toward camp. By the time she returned, the cadets were stirring fully. Drac was already awake, wings twitching anxiously as he repaired a cracked segment of his own shelter. He paused when he saw her burden. "You carry dirt," he said skeptically. "You are strong, but dirt does not feed or defend." Laura dropped the satchel at her feet and unrolled her toolkit. "It will," she said simply. She poured a small portion of water from her collector into the clay and began kneading it between her hands, mixing it with ash from the fire. The texture grew smoother, pliable, and she began shaping small rounded molds. Drac watched, mesmerized. "You make stones?" he asked. "Not stones," she replied. "Bricks." The process took hours. She arranged the molded bricks in a semicircle near the fire, letting the heat begin to dry them. Some cracked, others held. When she had a dozen, she stacked them into a low wall and coated the gaps with more clay. Then she placed metal shards and glass fragments inside, feeding the fire hotter with every breath of wind she could summon through the vent she had built. By mid-afternoon, the flames inside the clay enclosure burned white-hot. The heat shimmered so intensely that Drac had to back away. "It will melt," he warned. "Yes," Laura said, her voice calm and almost reverent. "That's the point." When she pulled the first glowing lump of metal from the pit with improvised tongs, even she felt a surge of disbelief. The object dripped with molten streaks, but it cooled into a small ingot with a faint metallic sheen. Crude, irregular, but undeniably forged. The first tool metal produced by hand on this world. The camp gathered around her, staring at the thing as though it were sacred. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the avians broke the silence. "You made the world yield," he said softly. Laura smiled faintly and dropped the ingot into a shallow pool of water to cool it fully. "No," she said. The world was always willing. You just have to listen to what it offers. By sunset, she had melted enough fragments to make several small pieces: hooks, nails, and 2 blunt knives. She handed one of the knives to Drac, who took it carefully, holding it with both hands. His wings trembled slightly. "Your kind," he said, "creates weapons from the earth itself." She shook her head. "Tools, not weapons. That depends on who holds them." He turned the knife in the firelight and seemed to understand. That evening, as the twin moons rose over the desert, Laura set up a second fire pit beside her foundry. She adjusted the airflow through carved tunnels in the ground, controlling the heat with astonishing precision for such primitive equipment. The wind itself became part of her design. She redirected it through hollow stones to keep the fire breathing steadily, even when gusts threatened to snuff it out. The result was mesmerizing. 2 fires working in harmony, one for warmth, one for creation. The aliens whispered among themselves, calling her the Forger and the Flameborn. While the others rested, Laura stayed awake, refining her process. She had long stopped noticing the burn marks on her gloves or the ache in her shoulders. Her movements were instinctual now, the rhythm of centuries of human survival compressed into one small figure shaping light from darkness. She forged nails and rods, hammered plates into shape using rocks as anvils, and used molten glass to seal cracks in the walls. The camp that had once looked like a scattering of debris now began to take form, a small network of functional shelters bound by innovation rather than fear. Drac brought her water at intervals, watching her in silence. Finally, he asked, "Do you not rest?" She looked up briefly from the glowing metal and said, "Rest comes after safety." He tilted his head. "And when safety comes?" She smiled faintly. "Then I'll build something new to worry about." By midnight, the temperature dropped sharply again. The desert turned brittle and white beneath the moons. Laura extinguished one fire, leaving the foundry burning low. The metal gleamed faintly under the ash. She sat near it, exhausted but satisfied, her mind already calculating improvements. A stronger airflow system, better molds, maybe even simple hinges for doors. The idea of doors made her laugh quietly. What a strange luxury that would be out here. As she stared into the cooling embers, a faint vibration reached her ears. Not wind this time, movement beneath the surface. The ground trembled slightly, enough to send ripples through the water in her makeshift basin. She frowned and pressed her palm to the earth. Something was alive down there, something large. Drac noticed her stillness and approached cautiously. "You sense danger," he said. She nodded slowly. Maybe, or maybe opportunity. Before he could ask more, a plume of fine sand erupted several meters away. From the hole emerged a segmented creature the size of a man's torso, its exoskeleton glinting with metallic ridges. It hissed, striking at the air with spined limbs. The cadets scrambled back in panic. Laura grabbed the half-cooled metal rod beside her and stepped forward. The creature lunged, but she sidestepped, striking it along its body. Sparks flew, and the impact left a dent. It recoiled, stunned, then retreated into the sand. Drac stared at her, speechless. "You confront it without armor," he said. "That's the difference," she replied. "Armor hides fear. Action ends it." The other cadets looked at her with newfound respect, the fear that had defined their first day replaced by something deeper: trust. She wiped the sand from her visor and turned back to the fire. The creature's metallic scales had left residue, proof of usable ore buried beneath the surface. That was what she had been looking for without knowing it. She smiled, weary but satisfied. "Looks like our guest brought us a gift," she murmured. As the others returned to their shelters, still whispering about what they had witnessed, Laura placed the dented metal rod back into the forge and watched it glow anew. The desert's rhythm pulsed around her, wind, fire, and the faint heartbeat of something alive beneath the ground. The foundry crackled and hissed, but she didn't flinch. The world was speaking again, and she was listening. By dawn, her camp would no longer be just a survival site. It would be the beginning of something far greater, the first forge of Zor 9, born from a human's hands, sustained by her stubborn refusal to yield. The third day on Zor 9 began with a silence that felt almost wrong. The wind had stopped for the first time since the cadets landed, leaving the desert in a strange, breathless stillness. Even the dunes seemed to hold their shape, frozen under a sky that shimmered like polished metal. Laura stood outside the foundry, her visor reflecting the twin suns as she scanned the horizon. Something about the air felt heavy, charged, as though the world was holding its breath. She knew that kind of silence from her time on the Martian colonies. It never meant peace. It meant the storm was coming. She wiped the grit from her hands and checked the structures one by one. The shelters had improved since their chaotic beginnings. Now they stood in a circle, connected by trenches and low walls, reinforced with the bricks and glass she had helped them make. Smoke from the foundry curled lazily into the pale air. Drac emerged from his shelter, carrying one of the metal knives she had forged. His antennae twitched nervously as he approached. "The sand smells different," he said. "The ground hums." She nodded, feeling the faint vibration through her boots. "Pressure shift. It's not just wind. Something big is forming up there." He looked up uneasily at the sky, where the suns burned behind a thickening haze. "You sense storms as if you were part of the planet," he said. Laura gave a faint smile. "Humans learn to listen to danger long before we learn to fight it. We don't ignore what we feel in our bones." She moved quickly through camp, giving quiet instructions. "Seal all openings, reinforce the roofs, anchor anything that can fly away. This isn't a breeze, it's a planet killer." Most cadets obeyed without argument now. The memory of her first fire, her first forge, had burned respect into their minds. Even the proud reptilians began to dig trenches alongside her, their claws tearing through the earth. The avians folded their wings and helped carry heavy stones. For the first time, the mixed species camp worked like a single organism. Laura's mind ran through every possible failure. If the storm came from the east, the windbreaks might hold, but the foundry vents could become weak points. If it came from the south, the dunes might collapse into the camp. She chose the safest risk, sealing most of the tunnels and directing airflow through one main trench that curved around the camp like a crescent. It would either save them or bury them all. By midday, the horizon had turned black. The haze grew into a wall of darkness, stretching from one end of the sky to the other. Lightning flickered inside it like veins of molten fire. The cadets froze as the first gust swept through, hot and sharp enough to sting through fabric. Laura's voice cut through the rising howl. "Inside, now, all of you!" She waited until the last alien disappeared into the shelters before diving into her own. The sound outside became a roar, as if the atmosphere itself was being torn apart. Sand hammered against the stone walls like rain made of knives. The temperature plummeted. The lights inside flickered and died, leaving only the glow of the forge's coals through the cracks in the wall. The air grew dense and hard to breathe. Laura crouched near the entrance, clutching her toolkit and monitoring the airflow through the small ventilation shaft. If the wind reversed direction, the pressure could implode the entire structure. Drac was inside with her, crouched in silence, his compound eyes wide. "How long?" he asked, shouting to be heard over the noise. "As long as it wants," she answered. "But if the structure holds, we'll live." The storm hit its full fury within minutes. The ground trembled as if alive. Sand poured through every seam, coating her visor and choking the air filters. She pressed her shoulder against the wall, feeling the vibration of impact after impact as debris struck from outside. Then came a sound deeper than thunder, a low, grinding moan, the voice of the planet itself shifting under pressure. The trench outside was working. She could hear the wind's path diverting around them instead of straight through. But the old foundry vent gave a sharp metallic shriek. Laura knew what that meant. If the vent tore open, the suction would rip half the camp apart. She grabbed the glowing rod from the forge, the metal still radiating faint heat, and crawled toward the narrow passage. Drac reached out to stop her. "You cannot survive out there," he shouted. She looked back once, her eyes calm. "Then the rest of you can." Before he could protest again, she pushed through the hatch and vanished into the storm. Outside was chaos incarnate. The world had turned into a river of dust, flowing sideways. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. She moved by instinct alone, crawling against the wind until she reached the foundry. Its structure trembled violently, the vent flap half torn from its frame. Each gust threatened to rip it free completely. She jammed her body against it, driving the heated rod through the hinge and into the clay wall. The smell of burning minerals filled the air. The rod glowed brighter as she forced it deeper, sealing the gap with molten slag. For a moment, it worked. The vent stopped howling. She exhaled slowly, realizing how close she had been to being sucked into the storm. Then the wind shifted again, stronger than before. A wave of sand crashed over her, knocking her backward. The world dissolved into motion, weightless, violent, endless. She clawed at the ground, anchoring herself to the structure, and managed to drag her body back inside, coughing hard enough to taste blood. Drac pulled her the rest of the way in, his hands trembling. "You are insane," he hissed. "Maybe," she said, her voice hoarse, "but now it's sealed." She collapsed beside the fire pit, her suit scratched and blackened. The storm's roar continued, but the rhythm changed. The trenches were working. The airflow had stabilized. One by one, the structures stopped shaking. The worst had passed. Hours crawled by before the sound softened into a distant whisper. The silence that followed felt unreal. Laura pushed open the hatch and stepped into the aftermath. The sky was pale again, streaked with red dust. The desert was unrecognizable. The dunes had shifted, the horizon erased and reborn in new shapes. Half the camp was buried to the roof lines, yet the center, her camp, still stood. The trenches glimmered with a thin film of water collected from the storm's condensation. She knelt and touched it. Cool, clean. She laughed quietly, a sound half joy and half disbelief. The others emerged one by one, blinking at the transformed world. Some wept openly. The avian cadets spread their wings, shaking off the dust. The reptilians hissed softly, murmuring words of gratitude in their language. Drac looked at her and said, "You built the path that saved us. You shaped the storm itself." She shook her head. "No one shapes a storm. We just learn how to bow without breaking." She began organizing the cleanup immediately, directing teams to dig out the buried shelters and salvage what was left. The cadets worked without complaint now. They followed her voice as if it were law. The foundry, scorched but intact, still smoldered faintly in the distance. When she approached it, she noticed something strange. The heat from the storm had melted the clay and sand together, forming a natural glaze. Inside the pit, rainwater had pooled, shimmering with mineral color. The result was beautiful, unexpected, accidental art born from destruction. She stood there for a long moment, staring into the reflected sky, her reflection fractured by ripples. Somewhere behind her, Drac approached and spoke quietly. "This planet listens to you," he said. "It fights, but it does not win." She smiled faintly without looking back. It never wanted to win. It just wanted to be understood. When night fell, the camp was alive again. Fires burned brighter, their smoke carried away by calm winds. The ditches glowed faintly where the trapped water reflected the twin moons. For the first time, there was laughter among the cadets. Real laughter, not the nervous kind born of fear. Laura sat beside the forge, wrapped in a blanket of coarse fabric, watching the others repair what remained. The exhaustion settled deep into her bones, but it was the good kind, the kind earned by surviving something that should have killed her. She leaned back against the warm stone, closed her eyes, and listened to the soft hum of life returning. In the distance, thunder rumbled faintly. Not a threat this time, but a reminder. The desert would never truly rest, but neither would she. The storm had taken much, yet it had given her something in return: water, unity, and proof that even on a dead world, life could begin again if someone dared to build first. And above them, unseen through the thinning clouds, the academy instructors watched the readings on their monitors with disbelief. Every other team had either perished or required rescue. Only one remained intact, thriving even, in the middle of the planet's most violent region. The report wrote itself in quiet awe. Human subject demonstrated structural foresight, crisis leadership, and adaptive command instincts beyond simulation parameters. Laura didn't need to see their report to know what she had done. She already understood the truth written into every grain of sand beneath her feet. Survival was never about enduring what the universe threw at you. It was about reshaping the ruins into something worth living for. The morning after the storm dawned unlike any other. The desert no longer looked like the lifeless expanse that had greeted Laura and the other cadets days ago. The air carried the faint scent of moisture, a fragrance so foreign to this planet that it felt sacred. Thin mist hovered over the trenches she had carved before the storm, and where the violent wind had torn through the sand, shallow pools of clear water shimmered in the sunlight. The sky was clean, stripped of dust, revealing a soft gradient of color, lavender fading into gold. It was the kind of fragile peace that came only after chaos had exhausted itself. Laura rose slowly from where she had slept beside the forge, her body sore but steady. The coals inside the pit still glowed faintly, and as she stirred them, the fire sprang back to life, small and loyal. She looked at the transformed camp and felt something she hadn't felt since arriving: contentment. Around her, the cadets began to emerge from their shelters, moving carefully, as though afraid the stillness might shatter if they spoke too loudly. Some crouched by the trenches, touching the water with reverence. Drac was the first to approach her. His wings glinted under the sunlight, coated in a fine layer of mineral dust. "The desert has turned to glass," he said softly, "and you made it bleed water." Laura smiled faintly. "I didn't make it. I just gave it a place to rest." She knelt by one of the water channels and studied the surface. Fine grains floated there, seeds perhaps, carried from far-off places by the storm. She scooped a handful and examined them through her visor. They were tough, fibrous, the kind that could survive harsh conditions. She had seen their type before on dry worlds, dormant until the rare moment when water awakened them. She pressed a few into the damp soil near the edge of the trench. "Let's see if life remembers how to grow," she murmured. The other cadets gathered around, watching curiously as she worked. The avians whispered among themselves, and one finally asked, "You plant food?" Laura shook her head. "Not food, hope." She stood and began organizing the camp again, assigning tasks with quiet efficiency. "Reinforce the walls, filter this water into containers, gather all organic debris, anything that can decay. We'll make compost." No one questioned her anymore. The respect that had begun with fire had become something deeper. She wasn't just a human cadet now. She was their leader, the one who had turned survival into purpose. As the day warmed, the camp came alive with activity. The reptilian cadets used their claws to dig deeper water channels, widening the irrigation lines. The avians took to the air to scout for more debris or vegetation. Drac stayed close to Laura, observing everything she did with intense fascination. When she began building small clay pots to store water, he asked, "You make tools for every new thing?" She nodded. "Tools are memory. Once you make them, the next problem becomes easier." By midday, the temperature climbed again, but the camp no longer suffered under the heat. The new trenches carried moisture through the compacted soil, cooling the ground. Laura watched the tiny seeds she had planted earlier. They hadn't sprouted yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. Life was patient. It always had been. Later that afternoon, she decided to inspect the perimeter beyond the camp. She walked toward the ridge that had sheltered them from the worst of the storm. The sand here was fused into strange shapes, smooth, glassy forms that caught the sunlight like amber. In one hollow, she found something remarkable: a network of cracks where condensed water had seeped deep into the rock. She followed it downward until she reached a small cavity filled with pale, glimmering liquid. It wasn't just water. It was mineral-rich, tinted faintly green. She touched it with a gloved hand, and her senses flickered. The composition was unique, full of nutrients. She smiled. Perfect. She returned to camp with samples, explaining her discovery. We can mix this mineral water with soil to strengthen the clay and feed the seeds. It's like giving the ground vitamins. The aliens didn't fully understand the comparison, but they followed her lead. By evening, the camp smelled faintly of wet earth and smoke, a strange, comforting combination. Laura sat beside the growing irrigation ditch, her fingers tracing the damp edge where the water pooled. The desert reflected the sky in rippling mirrors. When the first sprout appeared the next morning, it was so small that only she noticed it. A single green thread pushing through cracked soil, defying everything this world had ever been. She didn't call attention to it right away. She just watched it for a long time, feeling an ache in her chest she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Humanity had always been haunted by the need to build, to conquer, to adapt. But this, she thought, was what it had all been leading toward. To make something live where nothing should. Eventually Drax spotted it too. His wings fluttered in disbelief. "It is alive," he whispered. "On a dead world." Laura nodded. "Because we stopped fighting it. We learned to work with it." Word spread quickly, and soon the entire camp gathered around the tiny plant. Some bowed their heads, others simply stared, their expressions unreadable. It wasn't just a plant. It was proof that existence could rewrite itself. The following days blurred together in quiet rhythm. Laura expanded the irrigation network, using the melted glass as channels to guide the flow. The foundry's heat hardened the edges, turning them into shimmering conduits of water and light. The cadets began referring to the place as the oasis, half in jest, half in awe. Even when she laughed at the name, she knew it was fitting. The academy had sent them here to test endurance. Instead, they had created life. When the transport ships finally descended through the pale clouds, the instructors expected to find ruins or scattered survivors. Instead, they found an organized settlement gleaming under the suns, shelters aligned with trenches, glass walls sparkling, and in the center, a small green garden trembling in the breeze. Laura stood beside it, her hands clasped behind her back, her uniform scorched and patched, but her stance unbroken. The lead instructor, a tall Yoran with translucent skin and narrow eyes, stepped out of the craft, visibly stunned. "Cadet Kent," he said, his voice almost wary. "Your group exceeded all predicted parameters. Survival rate, 100%. Explain." Laura met his gaze steadily. "We stopped trying to survive," she said. "We started living." The Yoran tilted his head. "You mean to say you disregarded the competition directive?" She smiled faintly. "I mean we learned something your directives can't measure." He looked past her at the cadets, who now stood together regardless of species, their bodies marked by the same dust and effort. For once, there was no hierarchy, no division, just shared creation. The Yoran said nothing more. He only stared at the small patch of green sprouting from the desert floor. As the transports prepared to take them back to the orbital station, Laura walked one last circuit around the camp. The foundry was quiet now, its fires extinguished. The trenches glimmered faintly under the suns, guiding the last of the storm water toward the center where the plants grew. She crouched beside them, brushing her fingers lightly over the leaves. "You'll grow long after we're gone," she whispered. "That's what matters." When she stood, Drac was waiting near the transport ramp. "You will leave this place," he said, "but it will remember you." She nodded. "Maybe, but I think it'll remember itself more." The shuttle lifted slowly, its thrusters stirring up soft spirals of dust. From above, the desert no longer looked barren. The camp formed a pattern, circles of stone, threads of green, and rivers of glass glinting like veins of light, It looked almost alive. In the observation deck, the Uran instructor turned to her and said, "You realize you changed the definition of this program. It was designed to test species endurance. You built a community instead." Laura looked out the window, her expression calm but resolute. Endurance is just survival without meaning. What's the point of enduring if you don't make something worth leaving behind? He didn't answer. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft hum of engines. The planet below receded into distance, but the glint of her camp remained visible for a long time, tiny, radiant, defiant. Laura closed her eyes, exhausted but satisfied. The Academy would study her data, debate her decisions, and rewrite protocols in response. But none of that mattered. What mattered was what she had proven, not just to them, but to herself. That humanity's strength was not in power or aggression. It was in the quiet, relentless need to build, to nurture, to turn even the most hostile ground into home. Far below, under the eternal suns of Zor 9, the small garden continued to grow, its roots gripping the soil that had once known only fire and dust. And for the first time in the planet's history, life had chosen to stay.